The other day, my buddy Jason asked me if I had any interest in building something like this, a communal work desk / conference table that he found on a site called OpenDesk. I said, sure. So let's get into it. The trickiest part of this build is probably going to be the leg assemblies. So let's start with those. And I'm going to go over a couple of ways that you can make these. That said, I think it'll be easier to explain if I back up and talk about the design first for a minute. So to design this, I started off by measuring out the office in order to determine the best size for the whole table. Once I had that, I played around with a couple of ideas in terms of the looks and how we'd actually build it before I settled on this one. And the only special things to note are that for my tools, and in order to be more efficient with materials, it's going to be a lot easier to make the leg assembly pieces split in half. So like this instead of like this. Okay, so in the shop, I started out by making a template out of some 1/4-inch plywood. Here I'm translating my SketchUp drawing into a real-world drawing by referencing the angles and dimensions. A more accurate option might be to print out a full-size template on paper and attach that to the wood, but this was easy enough. Once everything was looking good, I could start cutting. And really there are only two crucial cuts that have to be perfect here. This line and this line need to be perpendicular. So by referencing the plywood's factory edge and by using a large square, I could ensure that they were. After that, I kept working my way through it with a circular saw and a jigsaw until the shape was roughed out. And all of the other cuts are really just for aesthetics, so if you're a little bit off, it's not a big deal. The last thing to do to the template before I could start using it was to round over and refine with a mix of some power sanding and some hand sanding. Basically, just use whatever you can to get the shape to look exactly how you want it to. And if this is your first time to my channel, welcome. And thanks for checking out my stuff. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and notification bell so that you don't miss any of my future builds. Thanks. Okay, so that's one way that you can make the template, but another, arguably easier way is by using some digital fabrication. So here I'm going to quickly show how I can make a template on my Xcarve. To do that, I exported an SVG file from my SketchUp drawing, which I could import into Easel. That's Inventable's software that the Xcarve runs off of. Once it was in there, I set up all my parameters and then let it cut. And I'll be dead honest, if I was making something like this and not filming it, I would definitely do it this way. But whenever possible, I like to show alternate ways to do the same thing, since I know that having access to machines like these aren't always realistic for everyone. That said, I'm going to throw a link to the Inventables website in the description below, so if you're interested in learning more or trying out Easel, give it a look. Alright, so either way, at this point we have our template and we can start making actual pieces. So here I'm tracing the shape 8 times onto a piece of 3/4-inch plywood. And the reason that I'm making 8 is because each leg's going to be 1.5 inches thick. The other thing to note here is that I'm not paying attention to grain orientation. And that's because at this point, I thought I was going to paint the whole base. And we might still, who knows. The next step was to use the template over at the router table along with a flush trim bit. And this is pretty straightforward and simple, but routers are always kind of scary to me, so just take your time and be careful. Which I guess is good advice with any tool. So then, I don't know, be extra careful with the router, I guess. And actually, special shout out to a couple of careful individuals. TJ Brill, Jason Wolski, Keith Kachi, and the rest of my Patreon members for making these videos possible. I can't tell you how important your support is to helping me make these videos, but I'm gonna try. It's really important. Really. So if you want to find out more about how you can support the show too, and snag one of these sweet 4 Eyes shirts, check the Patreon link in the description and see if it's right for you. And as always, no pressure. With all my pieces cut out, next I could start assembling them. So in order to attach the 2 halves, I'm going to use a pair of dominoes. Once that was done, I left them to cure overnight, and then the next morning I could laminate them together so that I was left with 2 finished leg assemblies. And then I could move on to the aprons and the stretcher pieces. For those, I'm actually going to start by cross-cutting a piece of plywood to the finished length of the stretcher pieces. That way, as I rip things out, they'll end up their finished dimensions, and I don't have to individually cross-cut multiple pieces. So while I'm ripping a bunch of strips, let's cut to an animation to give you a better idea of what I'm doing. At this point, all we have are our 2 leg sub-assemblies. To tie those together, we're going to need a total of 9 apron pieces. 4 of them are going to be 3 inches wide, and we'll laminate them together to form beams that are 3 by 1.5 by 78 inches. 2 of them we're going to rip to about 4.5 inches wide, and these will get refined in a bit to match the angles of the ends of the leg pieces, and you'll see that in a minute. 2 more we're going to cut to 6 inches wide, along with 1 that's 6.5 inches wide. And these are going to form a hollow box beam thing that runs down the center of the table for support and to hide all of the cables. Here I'm cutting the aforementioned aprons to match the leg end angles. So I started with a 45-degree cut, held it up to the leg, marked it out, and then I could make my second cut. And now I'm actually going to shut up for a second and take care of the rest of what we just talked about, along with a little pre-sanding on some of the areas that are going to be hard to get to later. Okay, I'm back. So here I'm doing a sort of mock assembly. I'm just getting things attached, making sure that it's all going to work out and so forth before I refine anything. To do that, I'm going to screw the leg assemblies to some scrap pieces at their finished distance apart, and then I can go about attaching everything. And once I was certain that it was all looking good, I took it apart, headed over to the router table, and rounded over any of the pieces that might possibly get touched. Now here I'm doing the actual assembly. And this is going to be a lot easier and faster since everything is pre-drilled at this point. And I'm not using any glue here because this could potentially need to be taken apart and moved, and honestly it's plenty strong with just screws. I should also mention this design could easily be turned into a dining table as well. Basically just make the top out of 1 piece instead of 3 pieces. And speaking of that, let's get to work on the top now. So here I'm pretty much doing the same thing that I did with the aprons by cross-cutting the entire sheet to what's going to be the finished length of 7 feet 10 inches long. But rather than doing it on my table saw, I'm using a track saw. And this is actually the Kreg ACS that you saw me use a couple videos back, only instead of using the track on the table, I've detached it and I'm using it like a traditional track saw system. Once that was done, I headed over to the table saw to start ripping things. So here I'm cutting my pieces in half and then doing a little dance. And while I rip my pieces to their finished widths of 3 inches and 19.5 inches, let's take a second to thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. I've been using Squarespace for almost 2 years now. I recommend it to people all the time, both here and in my personal life, and I haven't heard one person complain yet. And I think the reason for that is because it's just drop dead simple and the outcomes look awesome. They have a bunch of really great looking templates that are perfect for any kind of website you might be dreaming up, be it a personal portfolio, an online store, or something for a brick and mortar like a restaurant. And if you ever need assistance, they have great customer service, which I can personally vouch for. So no matter what you're looking to do, they'll be there to help you do it. And best of all, right now you can start a free trial by visiting squarespace.com/4eyes and save 10% off your first purchase when you use the offer code 4eyes at checkout. So if you're thinking about starting a website, or even if you have an existing one, you owe it to yourself to give them a look. Alright, thanks Squarespace. Next I took a piece of scrap and marked it out to be the same height as the, I guess we'll call it, electronics trough. Then I used my circular saw and a square to cut them to size and glue them in. And this is going to provide support for the center cover piece. So at this point, all of my pieces are cut and the table could be finished. But I want to add in some extra little cable management niceties, so let's work on those. In this shot, I'm ripping a piece of scrap walnut to 1 inch thick. Then I marked out some hole locations and went over to the drill press where I could drill a small pilot hole followed by a larger 1/4 inch diameter hole. And what I'm aiming to do at this point is create 2 pieces that look like this. Alternately, you could use something like the X-carve to get to this point as well. So I'm going to show both ways. So to do it on the X-carve, I'm going to open up easel and draw out the shape and then carve it. I guess there's not really much more to explain than that. But in any case, no matter how you get to that point, next I'm going to use my bandsaw to make a cut right down the center of the piece, splitting the holes into 2 half circles. And then over at the table saw, I can set my fence and make sure that the pieces are identical thicknesses. Thickness, whatever plural for that is. Then after a bit of sanding and rounding over the sharp edges on the router table, it was back over to the table saw to cut the large piece into smaller individual pieces. Next I set up the drill press with a Forstner bit and mortised some shallow holes into either end of each block. And these are just the right size to hold a pair of magnets. Back over at the table, I traced out the shape of my cable holders, transferred the locations of the magnets, and installed more so that the cable holders would work. And here's a little preview of them. Honestly, they might be kind of unnecessary, but I figured it could help to prevent phone chargers and that sort of thing from accidentally falling into the electronics trough. After that, I drilled out some larger holes in the bottom of the electronics trough for the cables of the surge protectors to exit and plug into an outlet. After I got the top attached, I mortised in a few more magnets to hold the center cover in place. And this isn't really very strong, but it really doesn't need to be. It just gives a sort of positive stop for when you remove it and replace the cover so that you know it's in the right place. Next I put a chamfer on the underside of the top, and a small radius on the top edge. And I probably should have removed these to do this, rather than holding the router upside down, but it worked. Next time though, I'll remove it and do it the normal way. Then it was on to sanding, finishing, and delivering this guy to the office so they could start using it. So what do you guys think about the table?
It makes the office seem a lot bigger. I really do love the aesthetics of the new desk. The wood's really nice, but the workmanship's a little janky.
Alright, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.